Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar organized by Association for the Study of Liver Diseases, Bangladesh. We have three eminent speakers from the region here. The first speaker to speak today will be Professor Selimur Rahman, a former UGC professor of Bangladesh and the president of the Alsatian. We also have Professor Obhijit Chaudhary. He is the head of the liver department at the Postgraduate Institute in Calcutta. At the same time, he is an important member of the COVID-19 management team that Honorable Chief Minister Mamata Banerjee has set up in West Bengal. We have here legendary liver transplant surgeon from Dr. Rela Institute, Professor Mohammad Rela. We have an eminent panel of experts here today who are all leading hepatologists of the country. I see on the screen Dr. Mahbub Hussain. He is the head of the Department of Hepatology and Associate Professor at Rangpur Medical College. Professor Ghulam Masood, head of the Department of Hepatology, Rajshahi Medical College. Dr. Alok Kumar Raha, Associate Professor and Head, Department of Hepatology at Chittagong Medical College. We have Dr. Muhammad Fazul Karim, who is the Associate Professor and Head of the Department of Hepatology at Sir Solimullah Medical College in Dhaka. Also with us is Professor Dr. Farooq Ahmed, who is an Associate Professor and Head Department of Hepatology at Dhaka Medical College. Unfortunately, we had two more panel members today, Dr. Harun Rashid from Rajshahi Medical College and Dr. Izazul Haq from Kumilla Medical College. Unfortunately, both are diagnosed with COVID. One is in home isolation, other is getting treated at a city hospital. We have learned that both are stable. We pray for their early recovery. And without any further delay, it's now my pleasure to invite Professor Selimur Rahman, President Association for the Study of Liver Diseases, Bangladesh, who is an former University Grants Commission Professor of Bangladesh, Government of Bangladesh, and also former professor of the Department of Hepatology at the Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujib Medical University, and one of the founders of hepatology in this country, to speak on chronic liver disease and during COVID-19 times. Thank you very much. Sir, শুরু করে স্যার।
হ্যাঁ শুরু করছি। Thank you, Professor Mamun, for inviting me to start the first lecture. First, I like to thank Professor Obhijit Chaudhary and Professor Mohammad Rela from Calcutta and from Chennai. They have given their very valuable time to enrich us with the experience of COVID. And actually, India is our neighbor, and so their experience we can utilize in treating our patient. These two speakers, all of you know, that are very familiar in my country. They have visited my country many times, and they have enriched our students and young doctors and also us with their experience and knowledge. And also, I thank all the participants who have registered for the webinar, and they have also given their time to listen to us. I have been given the responsibility to speak on chronic liver disease and COVID-19. What is chronic liver disease? It is the inflammation of the liver which lasts for more than 6 months, and it comprises chronic hepatitis and cirrhosis of liver. COVID-19 pandemic caused by SARS-CoV-2, a generation of coronavirus, which is also known as novel coronavirus. This SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19 has already affected more than 12 million people worldwide. The primary clinical manifestation was pulmonary disease, but there is increasing data that it is multi-system involvement disease, and it also includes gastrointestinal tract, and liver. More than 60% of the patient presenting with GI symptoms and a significant proportion, approximately 33%, presenting with elevated liver biochemistry. SARS-CoV-2 virus is an enveloped single-stranded RNA virus, and the spikes protein has affinity for the ACE2 receptors, which is richly present in GI tract and liver. And people have started thinking that they have got tropism for GI tract and liver. This picture shows that the coronavirus has got the affinity for ACE2 receptors, which is plenty present in GIT and also in cholangiocytes and hepatocytes. The clinical manifestation and GIT, that's why anorexia, nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. And in liver, the clinical manifestation is raised liver enzyme. What is the pattern of liver injury? Aminotransferase elevation, common in patients presenting with COVID-19, and the pattern of abnormal liver biochemistry is characterized by more rise of AST than ALT, and also sometimes associated GGT elevation. But usually the alkaline phosphatase and bilirubin is normal. And this picture is like that of alcoholic liver disease and ischemic and congestive liver injury, and unlikely to be of B and C hepatitis. This table shows the biochemical abnormality, which is shown as AST, ALT, and really alkaline phosphatase and bilirubin, and abnormality of serum albumin, GGT sometimes, and prothrombin time abnormality is very rare. These abnormalities are associated with severe liver disease and sometimes occasionally associated with increased mortality and morbidity. This picture shows the spectrum of liver injury by COVID-19. You know that we use many drugs for the treatment of COVID-19, and these drugs may also induce abnormal liver function. And COVID-19 has got an immunological mechanism of liver injury, and so you can see it through the cytokines. Sometimes the cytokines is plenty, and we call it cytokine storm. And as I have already said, that the coronavirus protein spikes have got affinity or tropism for ACE2 receptors, which are plenty present in GIT and liver. And there is also associated muscle injury, which also contribute to the raised transaminase. And there is, in severe cases of COVID, there is cardiomegaly, cardiomyopathy, which is also associated with congestive liver, which combinedly contributes to the abnormal liver function. What is the potential cause of liver injury in COVID-19? Hepatic injury from SARS-CoV-2 infection is due to either direct effect of the virus or consequence of the systemic disease. The immune response to SARS-CoV-2 is characterized by very high level of IL-6, involved in both the inflammation and the repair response in liver disease. COVID and cardiomyopathy and hepatomegaly. As I have already said, that there is cardiomyopathy, and from which there is congestive liver and hepatopathy, and this contributes to the raised biochemistry of the liver. And also there is severe ischemic hepatitis in severe COVID cases. Rarely alkaline phosphatase is raised. This may be due to drugs, or this may be associated with cholestasis of sepsis. COVID-19 drugs and hepatotoxicity. An increasing number of drugs used in hospitalized patients with COVID-19 have a distinct risk, time course, and pattern of liver injury. In my country, these drugs are these are used for the management of COVID-19. These are low molecular weight heparin, broad spectrum antibiotics, remdesivir, and favipiravir. These two are antivirals, and systemic steroid tocilizumab, which was previously used in rheumatoid arthritis. Convalescent plasma therapy is also used, and hydroxychloroquine is also used sometimes. These drugs, some of the drugs also contributes greatly in abnormal liver biochemistry. Mortality of chronic liver disease with COVID-19. In a published journal, it has been claimed that patients with liver disease without cirrhosis have got 14%, 12% mortality, and patients with cirrhosis have got more mortality, about 40%, and patients with decompensated cirrhosis. Patient with cirrhosis about 40%, and patient with decompensated cirrhosis about 43 to 63%, which is much more higher than the normal death in COVID patient without liver disease. COVID-19 and chronic liver disease. We know that hepatitis B and B is very much prevalent in South Asia and also in China, and it has been other than Europe and America, and it has been claimed that chronic hepatitis B infection appears that it does not affect the outcome of COVID-19. Patients with cirrhosis and COVID-19 are at increased risk of development of decompensation of the liver disease and ACLF. Management. If you consider management, there is some general management. All patients with chronic liver disease should adhere to the common rules of physical distancing, hand washing, and wearing mask. We can divide the patient in 4 subtypes for better management. Patient with chronic liver disease, including compensated cirrhosis. Patient with decompensated cirrhosis, including hepatocellular carcinoma. Patient with hepatocellular carcinoma, and patient after liver transplantation, which will be better discussed by our co-speaker, Professor Muhammad. General consequence of the patient with chronic liver, general consideration for patient with chronic liver disease, including compensated cirrhosis. Visit to the hospitalized specialized center can be delayed or temporarily postponed. Routine laboratory testing can be performed outside the hospital, and telemedicine and telephone call may be taken help for avoid hospital admission, and emphasis on the importance of vaccination of Streptococcus pneumoniae and influenza is also advised. Some specific consideration is there, and patient with viral hepatitis actually no increased risk of severe course of COVID-19, and we should follow up this patient and give prescription over telephone and on telemedicine, and if they take drugs, that should be continued, which can be prescribed through telemedicine. Patient with NAFLD and NASH, which will be better discussed by Professor Abhijit Chaudhary, and they also have comorbidity, so risk is there. And in cases of autoimmune hepatitis, there is increased risk, and nowadays it is advised not to reduce the immunosuppressive therapy in these cases. Patient with compensated cirrhosis, consider delaying HCC surveillance and screening for varices. Individualized and non-invasive risk assessment is advised. Patient with decompensated liver disease, including hepatocellular carcinoma. Minimal exposure to medical staff by using telemedicines and telephone. Listing for transplant should be restricted to very poor short outcome patient, and very serious patient, reducing the inpatient liver transplant evaluation that should be evaluated outside the hospital to reduce the hospital stay and reduce the contamination. Prophylaxis of spontaneous bacterial peritonitis and hepatic encephalopathy should be closely monitored. We should include testing for SARS-CoV-2 in these cases, especially where there is decompensation. Patients should hepatocellular carcinoma should continue systemic treatment, and evaluation should also be continued for transplant in seriously ill patients, and maximum exposure to the medical staff, minimize the exposure of medical staff by using telemedicine, and in case of COVID-19 cases, early admission is recommended. General treatment consideration for patients with chronic liver disease and COVID-19. These patients are affected with COVID-19. Consider early admission if presence of additional factor, and antiviral therapy to continue, and according to the state local guideline, we can use the experimental antiviral in this patient when needed. Prevent acetaminophen overdosing, and also avoid NSAID. A specific treatment consideration for patients with chronic liver disease and COVID-19. In patients with decompensated cirrhosis, treatment for cirrhosis-associated complications such as ascites, hepatic encephalopathy, SBP should be continued. In patients with HCC, the treatment regional therapy should be postponed, and immunotherapy may be deferred temporarily, and other treatments such as kinase inhibitors may be continued if needed in a reduced dose. What about the related diagnostic procedure, liver-related diagnostic procedure? First, let us come to the endoscopy. If the patient is not affected with COVID-19, then if it is not emergency, we can delay the endoscopy. But if it is an emergency, impending variceal rupture, or in case of bleeding, we can do endoscopy with precaution, and non-invasive risk factor assessment should be encouraged. And if ERCP is needed, and we can do it in very serious patient, in post-transplant cases when it is necessary, and also in cases where delay will harm the patient. In those cases, we can do, but there is also risk of transmission. Endoscopy of COVID-19 cases. Endoscopic procedure is only done in active bleeding cases and to save life. And if it is not very much necessary, then we can postpone and do it later on, because endoscopic procedures are associated with an increased risk of dissemination of COVID-19. HCC surveillance. HCC surveillance can be deferred without COVID-19 case. Without COVID-19 can be deferred based on available resources at the center. And patient with increased risk such as elevated alpha fetoprotein, advanced cirrhosis, chronic hepatitis B, these cases may be prioritized. Patient with COVID-19, ultrasound should be deferred and should be done after the patient becomes all right. Liver biopsy, if there is liver mass, we can do, and in some cases where without liver biopsy we cannot start treatment, then in those cases we can do. But in cases of COVID-19 positive, we should defer the procedure, and because inflammation of the liver by COVID itself may alter the picture, and liver biopsy may represent a risk of viral transmission. In conclusion, we can say COVID-19 pandemic has poses enormous challenge to healthcare system, as there is no effective treatment or vaccination till today. So the management is changing every day, and so also the management of CLD with with or without COVID-19 is changing. However, patients with advanced liver disease and those with liver transplantation represents vulnerable patient cohort with increased risk of infection and severe course of COVID-19. To prevent hospital-acquired infection, it is advised to communicate through telemedicine and to minimize the hospital admission and to prevent transmission of virus to patients and healthcare providers, and to also to side by side to maintain the standard of the care. Thank you all. Thank you for your patience hearing.
Thank you, Professor Salimur Rahman, sir. We shall have the question answer session after the talks by the three speakers. I now invite Professor Obhijit Choudhury, sir, to speak, please speak on non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Thank you, sir.
A very good evening to all of you. I'm really glad because of many reasons. The primary reason is, I think you can see my slides.
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. So I'm primarily also happy because I can talk to my brethren in Dhaka, and as most of you know that I'm a Bengali. And I'm a Bengali with lineage in Bangladesh, and I'm so proud of that. I've got my lineage in Gopalganj. So I keep on, whenever I get an opportunity to talk to people from Bangladesh, I feel that I'm back home. Although right now all of us have got a prevention and barrier of reaching out with that amount of warmth and affection. But this screen of the computer is providing us a little opportunity, and I'm so happy. And I'm also so happy to see, that that people are coming out, people are getting drenched in COVID and coming out of it. And glaring example is Mamun Al-Matab. I didn't know that he's something like Prometheus. So it's like Prometheus Unbound. I'll tell you why I say this. Right now, as Mamun told, and I think some of you know that the day the COVID pandemic started all over the globe and Bangladesh was in flame as much as we are in West Bengal and in India, I was itching to contribute in whatever way to help or to contribute in the scenario of Bangladesh. So that remains even today. And I think I consider this as an opportunity that I would share some of my thoughts. And those thoughts are mostly in COVID containment and COVID management, as I was just sharing with Dr. Rela also. He's also deep into COVID management. So I know, I think I'll talk to you more of very, pragmatic COVID issues. And given the fact that I had been told to talk on NASH, which is obviously something that keeps us afloat and keep us united, I'll start talking on NASH, but I'll trespass into the COVID territory and more of the social issues and management issues of COVID rather than the scientific issues. Because let me start off by saying that COVID management is more of a socio-political issue right now, and decision issue, strategic issue, rather than a scientific issue. Because as all of us know, that we don't have any drug that can do wonders in COVID. So basically, whatever we are keeping on prescribing is something more than placebo. And we believe that it works, but all of us possibly know that if it helps to me to some extent, it's good. And we cannot but stand from not consuming a drug. That's why we consume drugs when we are unwell. We doctors are unwell. We also do that. We also behave like any patient. So with that proviso, let me start off by sharing with the patient, and this is a common scenario. So this patient is a real life patient that I faced very recently. He's a 50-year-old male, is a known diabetic for 10 years on OHA with a very infrequent follow-up and checks, and that's the usual scenario. And he says that his blood sugar had been better recently. So when I asked the person, So he's hypertensive on drugs. He had a coronary artery disease also, had undergone an angioplasty. He is now on unstable angina on aspirin and clopidogrel, has got hyperlipidemia and is on statin, common scenario, as all of you know. He's on a lot of drugs for depression and is quite fat, as you will see subsequently. His BMI is 27, waist circumference 106 centimeters. Complains of a lot of snoring at night, and as you know, ASK is a very common accompaniment. So this is the classical person whom we call as comorbid and have got fatty liver as my way of looking at the metabolic dysfunction. And this person comes to me right now because I had been following this person for some time with sore throat, fever, and did not want to get tested till desperately unwell. I want to emphasize this is happening all so much everywhere possibly, and as much as in Bangladesh, I think in West Bengal, that the fear, the stigma, the confusion of being labeled as COVID infected is so high that nobody wants to hear the term called COVID, because we have equated COVID with death. Unfortunately, I wish to emphasize to all of my doctor friends, I think you expound this story to all your patients and your, everybody, that getting COVID is not equivalent to getting death. And possibly, COVID can be warned, as other people are pretty well known. So what we need to keep on, get out of it is, COVID is not equivalent to death. Otherwise, these people are reporting to healthcare facilities very late. And I'll tell you that we are doing some activistic endeavor in this. And this person tested SARS-CoV positive. And so this person is the classical comorbid diabetic who is, positive, and we are encountering this group of people all so much these days. And I just want to start off with a couple of caveats. We know very little of the virus, no aspects of what it does. And today only somebody has reported that it had been seen under electron microscopy. Known some of its means of its dreaded, we consider its deadly dance, have devised, advocated, and had been practicing some of the social remedies, which are mostly political, that are quasi-scientific. Let me tell you, allow me to use the harsh words. These are mostly quasi-scientific things that we are prescribing. The only remedy that helps people is oxygen and prone position when they need it. Nothing more than that works. Look forward to an enigma called vaccines, whose gallops are audible. But again, let me tell you, that's going to be share in very loud terms that, it's possibly going to be a wonder for some people, may not be that useful as we are talking of. Have been refuting utility of some drugs, while some others are likely to cloud the misty sky further and sooner. Multiple drugs. Everybody is claiming that my drugs work. And it's a sort of, mesmerizing scenario. We stayed at home for some time in the lockdown period, stared at the virus from the balcony, and fermented our knowledge and beliefs. Let me tell you, it's beliefs. All of us have got our own staunch beliefs, and kept on transmitting those in a very interesting democratic world with highly creative spirit. I mean every word. We have got many democratic worlds like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and all these. And we kept on spreading all those, rumors, myths, beliefs, and what I believe as science, and possibly are non-scientific things, and that has caused more harm to people and more stigmatizing in the society, fear, stigma, and all these. And we are into an understanding that we have to cope with the virus for some time, emotionally and biologically. And we are also accommodating the largely political, ad hoc, and let me again enjoy the freedom of calling it freestyle wrestling looking healthcare response everywhere in the globe. Be it Trump, be it Boris Johnson, be it Putin, be it my godfather named Narendra Modi. And everywhere this is happening. And so it's primarily a political response and with very little science into it. And let me tell you that I work and you work under such a system and try to put forth our abilities in this scenario, and we have to try to help our people to whatever extent possible. I look back and go back to a very age-old dictum, an age-old writing by Daniel Defoe, one of the best, novels on plague, that the infection was propagated insensibly and by such persons as were not visibly infected, who neither knew whom they infected and who they were infected by. And no other description of SARS-CoV can be better than if we can look back to the description of plague 500 years back by Daniel Defoe. And so we all know that a dysfunctional immune response is the key to the harm that it keeps on doing. And Dr. Salimur Rahman mentioned this very clearly, that a systemic cytokine storm is all that we are frightened of, and there is significant pulmonary edema which causes death in many, in whom, and widespread inflammation, and liver takes part in the inflammation. Now I come back to NAFLD. We had been dealing with a story of decades. NAFLD is a story of decades. We tend to forget. And now in NAFLD management, we had been trying to level this very mathematically by leveling it with FibroScan. Most patients had multiple comorbidities in NAFLD. We know that. As my patient had cardiac disease, diabetes, renal function status, are also important. Depression and lack of motivation, I told you, and mechanical dependence on pharmacotherapy may not be adequate. These are the mainstays of therapy. We now know, and Professor Salimur Rahman just mentioned, that CLD people have got a high 30-day mortality. And these are data that have come out very recently. So CLD people should be monitored better. And there are also data which is just coming in gastroenterology recently, that people who had pre-existing liver disease and had diabetes and had other things does worse compared to people who did not have pre-existing liver disease. I'm not going into detail. So mortality in this group of people are high. And we all know also that there are reasons for that. And Professor Rahman mentioned this. I'm not going into detail of that, only to mention that hypoxia, comorbidity are a very important cause of liver function derangements in this group of people. So in essence, people with pre-existing liver disease does badly when they get COVID compared to people who don't have liver disease. Now, as we know that NAFLD people are the people who are the classical comorbids. And these are the group of people whom we are dealing with right now, and there are data to suggest that particularly in young comorbids, NAFLD have got a very bad outcome, and people with NAFLD have got a very bad outcome. And so that also depends on BMI, age, and other factors, and these are all known. So again, the primary conclusion is that NAFLD people, when they contact COVID, should be given more attention than what we are providing in the context. So now the questions are, which I'm presenting for you is, whether the patient is to be managed in, and that's what I'm dealing with. And I would love Professor Rela's input subsequently, whether the patient should be at home or the hospital. You as a hepatologist also, and I don't consider you as a hepatologist because a hepatologist is a very reductionist term in the COVID era. So all of us have to behave like an internist, and as a global physician right now, and have to rise up to the occasion. So whether the patient has to be managed in a home or the hospital, priority attention has to be given or not, we have to balance based on comorbidity, outcome predictions, and what are the futures. So I'll discuss with some of those. And these are some of the slides that I keep on talking. So initially in the COVID, you can have either of the two approaches. Initially, we were thinking when the volume of infection was low, on the left-hand side, you see that there is a box wherein some of the people were unwell. Okay, so we were thinking that we will put all the infected into a hospital when the volume of infection was low. So the term was box the infected and pounds the red ones. The red ones are the comorbids and the people with, say, diabetics who are bad, uncontrolled, who have got heart disease and all. So this was the approach when we were all taking in the early phase when things were picking up in your country or my country or something like that. But right now, let me tell you, what I believe is it's more important, and we have started research in Calcutta, and I think this is I'd like to share that we are trying to target making a registry of the vulnerables who are the comorbids and trying to see whether a targeted attention, early testing, early triaging, and early hospitalization in them improves care or not. This is a case control study which we are undertaking. So the name of the study is Box the Vulnerable. So, you know, most of the people, we by now know that 80% of the COVIDs are asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic, or 85%. So why waste your hospital space if you can isolate them at home? And in West Bengal, and let me tell you that this somehow I contributed to this thought also, that we have created things called safe homes, where we have got only provided pulse oximeters and thermometer, and these are monitored by nurses only, and no medical doctor gives a visit in the morning and the evening and tries to, whenever the pulse oximeter gives us signs or some symptoms. So these are asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic people. We now then take them to hospitals. We are trying to give them. This is not, you know, that well fit yet into the system because of the fear, and there is because of the fear, psychosis, a non-supportive society, and the stigmatizing society. Many of the people tries to take the refuge in the hospital as a secure place. So we need to start telling that hospital is not a concentration camp or is not a jail where you should get in. Only people who are unwell desperately should go to the hospital. And herein, NAFL, comorbids, diabetics, cancer people should come into. So let us not forget that late detection and access is the key to bad outcome. Let me tell you that we have done a small study and we have found that people who are dying are mostly those people who had been having fever for 7-8 days. And because of the term corona conveys bad meaning and stigma in the society, did not get tested, because by testing may be detected to have corona, and that would mean bad things socially. The police would come, the corporation would come, and the surroundings would come to know. So tremendous stigma is prevailing, and I think all of us need to be bold and come out. And we have, I'll tell you, we have formed a society of COVID winners, and it's called COVID Care Network. And somehow I'm one of the, you know, it's an organization of COVID winners and associates. We have got a 24/7 helpline. We have got a website. We are managing home quarantine people, and it's led by a person. The secretary is a person who had climbed Mount Everest. His name is Satyarూప్ Siddhanto, and he had climbed he's a COVID winner. So now, right now, one of my jobs is I'm not looking for only, you know, strategy for the state, but I'm doing activism here also. So I'm looking for the COVID winners, and that's why whenever I get a COVID winner, I grab that person and tell, hey, you are the example to the society. And while before coming to this meeting, I went to one of the housing complexes and tried to counsel them, you know, to accommodate one of the COVID infected people in the locality whom they had been ridiculing. And you know, we need a supportive society right now which would rise. And I think Bangladesh society is no better in this way, should not be any better in this way than a Kolkata society. And stigma, fear, confusion, ostracization should be widespread. And I think we doctors need to have an important role to play, and community preparedness is very important, and accept the asymptomatics. Otherwise, they would be beaten up in the community. Comorbidity care is more important than COVID drug prescriptions, let me tell you. Right now, I'm sure you know that remdesivir or favipiravir or whatever you prescribe are just something more than placebo. But more important is management of diabetes, management of your, you know, antivirals, management of your hypertension, management of your cardiac disease. So I keep on telling everybody that please, whenever you get a person who is comorbid and COVID infected, always think that this person's comorbidity is more important than prescribing a COVID, anti-COVID remedy, which may or may not give dividend and only can, you know, level something. An important thing is that any turbulence in the NFLD or comorbid should arouse suspicion and should, you know, prompt for hospitalization. So I would, before I just, you know, told you, and before I end this talk, I would end with an appeal that hepatologists have to be an activist now. And I think with I'm a Bengali and all of you have got the same blood, and we have got tremendous role in activism. And right now, and I consider that Bangladesh is one of the most volatile activistic areas. Unless you do community activism, prepare the community to accept the asymptomatics, consider them as your brethren. COVID is not a stigma. COVID infected should be proud enough and come and say that I'm COVID infected and I've won the game. I have won it and you can win, and we should not ridicule them. Only you can win this fight. Otherwise, you and me are going to be burnt in the flame. Science is your vessel, not your display item. I have got very, given the fact that I had been organizing COVID care in the state, I had very bad experiences. I don't mind sharing those with you. Many of us are still frightened to touch a COVID patient, and we don't see the pulse even. I would appeal, that's a very small subset though, I would appeal that please encourage all your people to go and see the patient, shed your fear, and to pick up those people who are, unwell, and get them the necessary care, which is only oxygen, and prone position, which would improve oxygenation. I'm again simplifying things. Forget the reductionist approaches that we usually, undertake. And I think forge strategies that are contextually relevant and use common sense. Very important is common sense and contextual relevant strategy. So the strategy for Dhaka may not be the same as the strategy for, say, Rajshahi or Jashore. Or my strategy for Calcutta may not be the same for my strategy for Birbhum. So we have to understand, because this is a social issue. Again, I'm telling you that today Dhaka is burning. I'm not very clear about the scenario of Bangladesh, but tomorrow, let me tell you, the villages are going to burn even more. I mean, the flame is going to spread out. So let us keep rocket science in the terrace garden. Again, I'm very clear. We don't need any rocket science right now. We need very simple, box the vulnerable right now, and NAFL people are one of the vulnerable lots. Target care with compassion, with science, and science is available, and that science is oxygen therapy. See your patient and see your patient with attention, and prepare your community for accepting the asymptomatics. And whenever you get a COVID winner, that COVID winner can be the nidus for starting an organization for talking that I have won COVID, and COVID does not mean death, and you can also come out of it. With that, I thank you all for this opportunity, and I would love to be back with you anytime again. Mahmood had invited me on an earlier occasion also, which I could not, somehow I was in Birbhum, so I could not attend to. So I'm really glad that I could speak to you today. Thank you all for your patient hearing. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Abhijit Chaudhary, sir. You have, as usual, given a very thought-provoking talk, sir. Thank you very much. And now the last speaker of the day is Professor Mohammad Rela. He'll be speaking on the aspect of liver transplantation. And after Professor Rela's talk, we'll move on to the question and answer session. So, Professor Rela, please.
Dr. Rela, you are not audible. Please unmute yourself.
Okay, I'm sorry. I've not unmuted. Thank you, Professor Mahmood, and thank you, Professor Salimur Rahman, for that talk. I also enjoyed Dr. Abhijit Chaudhary's talk very much, because I liked the word you said. This is a social and political disease to treat. I agree with you, because the majority of the patients are like that, and I may have a slightly different view, because I really went into COVID in a big way when the government said that all private hospitals have to contribute. And anyway, I felt it was a responsibility, as you say, as a social responsibility, take it on. And I also had a personal view that our own staff, our own doctors, our own families really need to be looked after when the time comes. The point about this being a social disease, and there are many claims that this disease has got, you very clearly said that there is no treatment option for him. I agree with you that remdesivir or favipiravir, they don't do very much. I believe in that. As an antiviral, we don't have a treatment in this. But I think in the last 2 to 3 months, the understanding of this disease has been transformed so much. I believe that doctors can really do something. I mean, most of you are hepatologists here. I want to say something. I always say this to people. The classical example would be an acute hepatitis A infection. Majority of them recover. There is no indication for treatment for these patients. You tell them to go home and take rest and they recover. And there are so many quacks and so many people in our country who say that the jaundice can be cleared, and people go to them in preference to coming to the hospital. But the example is the patients who get acute liver failure in hepatitis A is the example I give to the patients who die of COVID. Really, the patients who are at risk of dying of COVID are the patients that we need to concentrate on, not the 85 to 90% of the patients who recover. Now, it's not something that we can say that we don't take it seriously, because if you look at the death numbers in the United States alone, if you say it's almost 125,000 deaths in the United States, how many times more than the death that happened in 9/11 is this? And are people being worked up about it, even though the numbers are so much higher than 9/11? People have to be worked up about it. I think it is a serious pandemic. It's actually shut us down for almost 5 months. It's likely to shut us down. Normalcy may not return for another 6 months. So it's not something that we can take very lightly. And India is appearing third in the world numbers for COVID. I wouldn't be surprised that if we actually overtake Brazil in the next 2 months and become
Dr. Rela, could you please click the slide preview?
Okay, sorry. Yeah. Yeah, we could become number 2 in the world, and hopefully not number 1. So that is the situation. It is a serious affliction. The earlier data that we got from China is really classified into mild, severe, and critical. This is probably an oversimplification of the whole thing, but very clearly gives an evidence that the mild patients are the ones we don't need to worry about, as Dr. Chowdhury said, Professor Chowdhury said, that they can be managed at home. We are concerned about the severe and critical in their classification, but I think the classifications have become better now. I think the patients we need to be concerned about are the patients who get breathless or who have their oxygen saturation is less than 95%. I think if we actually expect, or we actually make them come to hospital earlier, I do believe that we can make a difference in them. We talked about comorbidity. I'm not going to go into the comorbidity. Very clearly, patients who have had transplantation, patients who have had liver disease, all have a hazard ratio of really greater than 4. Liver disease has got a hazard ratio of dying of greater than 2. The more the comorbidity, the higher is the risk of death. So if there is a single comorbidity, the risk is 20%. If there is, I'm sorry, if it is 3%. If there is 2 comorbidities, actually it probably doubles in the risk of dying of COVID. So this is a more recent, really, severity grading that has come from the United States, which classifies into the asymptomatic and pre-symptomatic patients that the Chinese don't describe. The asymptomatic and the pre-symptomatic patients are probably not, we are not even aware of them, because we can only detect them when we do contact tracing. That's the only way of knowing that they exist. If there is no contact tracing, we're not going to know about these asymptomatic and pre-symptomatic patients. Usually, if you test only the symptomatic patients, the ratio of patients that you're going to detect are very small. But we are only concerned about the moderate and the severe illness and the critically ill patients. At the moment, I think that once they are critically ill and they are in intensive care, they are ventilated, I think their survival is extremely poor. And you can even question whether the resources should be allocated in the looking after these patients. You're talking about 2 to 3% of these patients where really it's very difficult to rescue. And I think that the ventilated mortality in India would be probably more than 50%. Now, I just want to, I like this slide, and it's not a detailed slide. I want to use this for people to understand the initial stage of the diseases where it's due to the viral response itself, is a phase where there is absolutely no treatment available. Really, the antivirals, you can say remdesivir may have a role in this phase. It might reduce the course of the illness, but whether you start or not with remdesivir in these patients, and it's still, I don't think it's so widely available. This phase is not something we concern about. And Dr. Chowdhury is very right in saying, actually, there is no treatment option for these patients. The second phase, which is the host inflammatory response phase, is when really the patients become sick, and towards the end, the very small proportion, maybe 5% of the patients who became very sick, or I think patients require oxygen. At least in our center, almost 25 to 30% of the patients who are admitted to hospitals actually require oxygen in ours. So the rest of them may have fever and some cough and illnesses. We don't admit asymptomatic patients into the hospital. So if you look at that state of patients, and once they go into the inflammatory phase, the antiviral drugs have no effect there to see. And we believe in this, and many people say that many of them may still be RT-PCR positive after 3 weeks, but they're not infective. The phase where the viral has gone, now we have got many survivors who have been ventilated and who have recovered, but they take almost 3 weeks or 4 weeks to recover. And we believe that after 3 weeks, it's even okay for these patients, if they've had a tracheostomy or when they've been extubated, to actually bring them back into a routine intensive care unit in a non-COVID situation where they can be looked after better, because the fear of these patients infecting after 3 weeks, 4 weeks is so negligible. And a lot of them are stuck in a ventilator for 2 to 3 weeks. So I'm talking about that group of patients where we can make a difference. I believe that RT-PCR is still the gold standard in the early stages, and also the negativity for RT-PCR towards the end is also being negative, is very high in the later phases. Now we've seen that many of the, are you able to hear me? It's saying that my internet is a little unstable. Can you hear me? Can
yes,
somebody else?
we can hear you. We can hear.
Okay, thank you. So this is a simple slide to say that even though we are not managing the virus with antiviral drugs effectively, we are now understanding, our understanding is better, and we are able to manage these patients' complications of the virus, that is the inflammatory state. So there are really two components that you need to face that we didn't understand right at the beginning. One is the mnemonic side of the things, where the alveolar membranes are thickened, where there is a problem with gas exchange due to the inflammation due to the virus itself. And the second is the thromboembolic, the vascular side of things, which are also affected. So not only is there a problem with on the ventilation side of the respiratory system, but there is also a problem with the perfusion side. So there is a huge mismatch. That's why some of these patients who may look extremely well, that is why people are asking them to carry their the saturation monitoring things. So even though they are well and it's a single system, they can get extremely hypoxic. And I think that's why once patients have respiratory problems, once they become breathless, they need to be managed in the hospital. And the two drugs, oxygen is absolutely right. Oxygen is the #1 drug. And there are two other systems which are helpful. One is the steroids, and again, the evidence is once the thrombosis incidence is high and the D-dimer levels are high, the risk of death is almost increased 20-fold when the D-dimer levels are greater than 1,000. When the D-dimer levels are more than 5 times normal, the risk of death is extremely high in these patients, and therefore it is possible to do something about it. I won't go into the chest X-ray, chest CT scans, because we don't we don't use that enormously for all the patients, and the chest CT findings sometimes look much worse than the clinical situation is, and therefore we manage patients more on a clinical grounds. We only do chest CTs on patients where the RT-PCR is negative, but we believe that these patients are COVID positive patients, and when we have classical findings on CT scans, we manage them as COVID rather than as not as COVID. So I think it is important that these patients have their inflammatory markers done. CRP, D-dimer these are very two important ones we use. In the early phases, we have been using a lot of IL-6 levels in these patients and giving them tocilizumab, but the drug was not very freely available, and I didn't think that tocilizumab made any, IL-6 inhibitors made any difference to the outcome of these patients in a big way. So D-dimers and CRP and lymphocyte count actually is a very important prognostic marker. Low lymphocyte count is very closely associated with non-cybervis in these patients. So I told you we went into this because partly we were pushed by the government to take patients, and partly because we also decided that it's important to take, and I think we have managed well over 700 patients, probably close to 750 patients, and most of these patients are moderate to sick patients rather than the ASM. We managed all, we had a different team to look after the patients on home isolation, where they were calling them at home and making sure they were well, and there was no treatment necessary for any of these patients. So we only looked after these moderate patients. And what we found, we started almost 2.5 months ago. Every week, the treatment protocols were changing. We had a team of about 10 doctors who were just looking at the literature to say that if there is any change that will make any difference. So our protocols, I believe, are well ahead of the protocols that came from the Indian government or the Tamil Nadu government or the ICMR. And we standardized our treatment protocols much earlier. But having said that, I think there are practical problems in looking after or running a hospital, so whether it's COVID or non-COVID. I think the general rules that we have to follow, we need to follow, because constantly we have nursing staff, the doctors who get infected, and some of them, I think the majority of them get infected outside, and I have to say that among the people within our COVID area, we usually have about 100 to 120 COVID patients. Now the numbers are coming down to about 70 to 80 patients, inpatients we have at the moment. We only had about 5-6 nurses and one doctor working within the COVID area who's got infected. Most of the doctors, I think overall, we have over 1,000 staff in our hospital, and we probably have around 30 people infected. Most of them are actually people who have been working outside or people who get infected through their families. Now, when one person gets infected, it becomes a huge problem. So all their contacts have to be isolated for 1 week, and then we do the tests at the end of the week. And because we have a transplant program, we have continued to do transplant. We also thought about doing because we test the patients twice before they're taken up for transplantation. And it's not uncommon for patients to ask us, "You're asking us to test, have you had a test?" So we even thought about actually testing doctors and nurses who are actually looking after these patients. And we have had one row of testing done, and occasionally you find that a nurse may be positive or a doctor may be positive, and that actually throws huge difficulties in really looking after patients and managing these doctors. So what I want to say here is, I think whether anybody is infected or not, social distancing within the hospital, where people gather together in canteens, maintaining distance, wearing masks, all of this has become a routine and has to continue to be a routine. And if these are not followed, then we will periodically get into trouble where you have to isolate 20 people or 30 people in a unit for 2 weeks, and then it becomes very difficult to run hospitals. And what is interesting here is actually eye protection also decreases really the risk of contracting COVID. And there has been, in the previous talk, many people were talking about whether COVID has become airborne, and there are some publications which believe that COVID has become airborne, because when you have a group of people within a closed room, or when there are aerosols, there is probably an increased risk in those situations. And there was some publication from the United States, where they made the masks mandatory for the public. In the New York City, the numbers after the lockdown came down, whereas in other states where there was no mandatory mask wearing, the numbers did not come down, indicating that there may be an element of airborne transmission of this virus. But I think WHO is still sticking to it. In terms of drug usage, I think we have really abandoned chloroquine, hydroxychloroquine, azithromycin. All of these combinations have had no effect at all. In fact, there is very clear evidence that hydroxychloroquine plus azithromycin combination is harmful. So we removed these from our protocols almost 2.5 months ago because there was nothing in the evidence. Remdesivir, we have included in our protocol. The drug is not still freely available, but a very small percentage of our patients have had remdesivir given to them. Quite often it is pressure from patients or VIP patients saying remdesivir needs to be given. And it's still not openly given to everyone, and I don't think it's hugely beneficial to patients. So antiviral, in our view, is really out. Interleukin 6, we started giving in the very early phase for ICU patients. We believe that it's not made any difference to the survival of the patients. Convalescent plasma has become very popular in India. In a lot of the government institutions, they're giving. But the problem comes that this is not actually given in the early phase. If it is, you saw the earlier slide, if this is to work, it should work really in the viral phase of the illness, not in the inflammatory phase of the illness. It's unlikely to really work. And we have given it in a few patients. It's not a routine recommendations. I think the two drugs which have made a difference from really the publications from the UK recovery study, I think everybody now follows that. Dexamethasone is what I believe has made a huge difference. I've seen in the early phase to the intermediate phase that once you start dexamethasone, we initially started dexamethasone as soon as they require oxygen. If their saturation level drops to below 94%, if they require even 2 liters of oxygen, we start them on dexamethasone. Now we find that if their D dimers are raised or if their CRP is raised, even before oxygen, we have started them on dexamethasone. We have actually stopped them from going into HT or ICU at all. Now, in the last 1 month, the number of patients actually progressing their illness beyond requiring oxygen has significantly come down with the usage of corticosteroids as well as with the usage of Clexane. I think you're dealing with two sides, the inflammatory sides, which is interfering with ventilation, and the vascular side, which is microthrombi. If these two are dealt with, I think you can hugely reduce the incidence of patients progressing with their disease and to become a mortality. I always say we have been lucky, India or Bangladesh have been lucky that we went into the disease much later on in the course of the COVID understanding. And if you look at the results in Italy and UK, where the mortality overall has been between 10 to 15%, and Tamil Nadu, I believe that we have a mortality generally of maybe 1.5%. And I would say when we take high-risk patients and symptomatic patients, our mortality is really less than 4%. And I think that is actually extremely good outcome for COVID patients. And that I would say is only because of the understanding of the disease process, we've been able to do better. I'm not going to talk much about COVID and liver. Dinesh, one of our, has done a very good review, which is published in Journal of Hepatology recently on really the effects of COVID and liver. And that says a lot. Professor Salimur Rahman has addressed most of these issues really. If the MELD is high, the risk of death is high. If the CLIF score is high, the risk of death is high. And we actually, what happened to us is we had 2 patients with decompensated liver disease who, before we started admitting COVID patients, both of them died very rapidly of pulmonary complication, which is when we really got worried. Let me just go into running a transplant program at the time of the COVID era. Now, this was a huge worry for us, and it was a huge worry for all of our doctors that we are a transplant program. Why should we go into COVID, and why can't we really apply to the government and say that? Pardon? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay.
Dr. Jackie, please mute yourself. Yeah. Continue, please.
So our doctors felt that we should apply to the government and ask for an exemption, because they were actually willing to give exemptions to transplant centers or hospital having many transplant patients because it was perceived as a high risk for our patients. And the second worry was this big publication from European centers where over 510 hospitals and over 60 countries looked at really generally surgery in general in the COVID era. And they found that if patients acquired COVID in the perioperative period, that is just before surgery or immediately after surgery, the mortality rate was more than 20%. I mean, this was a very alarming statistics over a large number of patients. But I have to say that these study came about at a time when the understanding of COVID was very poor, when European results were almost 10 to 15% mortality in general for COVID patients. I don't think that these results hold good, but this scary papers is what made us extremely worried about starting or continuing the transplant program during that time. And there were many unknowns at that time. So if we go back to so really throughout the world, the transplant numbers come down. This is the UK numbers, and the Indian numbers also came down. And our numbers also came down because the lockdown, patients were not able to travel to the hospital. We relied a lot on patients coming from the other parts rather than from Tamil Nadu. Only about 30 to 40% of our patients were from Tamil Nadu. The rest of the patients were coming from other parts of the country, and at about 25% of our patients were coming from the Middle East. So our numbers dramatically dropped during the COVID time, and that we did a statistics at that time, and we published this in Transplantation. There was a general dip in the number of transplantation carried in most of the large centers. And the Liver Transplant Society of India also came up with a recommendation which was published in Hepatology International, where they in fact put a moratorium on non-urgent transplant until April 14. So we had to stop doing it. So this is our numbers really. In the early March, we were doing big numbers. The tall lines represent 2 transplants every day. So we were doing 2 transplants every day in the beginning of March. And then the middle of March, the lockdown, end of about the 20th and 21st of March, I think the lockdown came and everybody shut down. But in the beginning of April, we spoke to Liver Transplant Society of India and said that we have got several sick patients and therefore we have to start doing. So we restarted doing. But at that time, we got stuck. When we restarted, we didn't think, we thought we were not admitting COVID patients at that time. So we had 2 patients with chronic liver disease, decompensated chronic liver disease admitted in ICU. And both of them tested positive. When we did a chest CT, they had a bad lung, and we did a COVID, and the COVID were positive. They were not in a COVID ward. They were in a general ICU, and we had a large number of patients in our ICU. And they were exposed to almost 20, 30 nurses and doctors. And at a similar time, also one of the donors we were working up for transplant in a child with acute liver failure. The donor, this is before the operation itself, we found that the donor was positive. So this was early time, this was April. So the government got very excited, ICMR got excited. They thought that the hospital staff were giving patients COVID. So we almost had a contact tracing, and about over 200 doctors and nurses were tested. And we were fortunate that not one of them were positive for COVID at that time. This was early time. So it was not us giving COVID to the patients. It was the patients who acquired, who already had it, who came into hospital with decompensated liver disease, and one was a donor. So again, we had to shut down because of, so these things kept propping up, and so we really had to put things in place. This is the 14th of April, after doing about 5 transplants, we found one of the donor being positive and 2 ACLF patients being positive. We have written those 2 patients up as an early case report of COVID-related death, really, in liver transplant patients. And we made huge changes to the way we separated off. Then we actually made half the hospital into COVID hospital. We made changes in how patients were looked after, our outpatients. And we took care that we made sure that every patient, every precaution is taken, and the face cover, everything was carried out both in ICU and I have to say that in spite of having 2 patients in a general ICU for almost 1 week and not having even one doctor or one nurse test positive, only says something about the precautions, the general precautions our nurses were taking. They were not wearing the full PPE at all. So that gave us really the confidence to restart, and then we restarted the program, and it's been running without any difficulty. Even though we have periodically donors who come for testing, or when the patients come, they test positive periodically for COVID, and we postpone the operations for these patients. We send them away, ask them to come back after 2-3 weeks if they are asymptomatic. We've been able to continue doing transplants really after our initial experience and how the infrastructure is being set up. Finally, to say that when patients who have had liver transplant, when they turn COVID positive, they seem to have a high mortality. Again, this is European numbers. The European numbers have shown almost 16% mortality in patients, transplant patients who acquire COVID. Out of 103 patients, 16 patients died. Again, this is European data. I don't know if this will still hold good, but if you look at the subsequent data, I'm sorry, can you guys hear me? Have I lost you?
Yes, we can hear you.
I can't move my slide at the moment. I think I've finished really. My slide is not moving. Oh yeah, it's moving now. So now the current opinion is that the long-term liver transplant recipients are at a higher risk because they are on less immunosuppression. The short-term liver transplant recipients, if they get COVID, transplanted less than 2 years, where the immunosuppression levels are relatively higher. In fact, it almost seems that they are protected from dying of COVID. The numbers are small, only 40 patients, so it may be a little too much to say they are protected. At least the risks are not higher in the early phase. And there have been one death, I think I didn't put that slide, in the perioperative period, again in Europe, where a patient died of COVID infection in the perioperative period. So it's not going to be easy to run a hepatology service or a liver transplant service. People are going to get infected periodically, and we have to constantly isolate people. And I think with the antibody testing, I'm pretty sure there will be a huge proportion of our doctors and nurses who will turn positive without even knowing that they have gone through. And until that time comes, I don't think the normalcy is going to return for our hospital practices. We have just done a hepatectomy a week ago. We have done 2 tests on that patient, but post hepatectomy, that patient is well, but he's turned positive for COVID. And now, and therefore, we have had to really isolate a huge number of doctors who have been involved in that operation and looking after. So it's a struggle that we go through. I'm not saying it's an easy way to go through, but we have to continue to do what we do. We cannot come to a standstill. If we come to a standstill, then more patients will die of the result of COVID, of not necessarily of COVID, because the mortality of COVID itself in our setup or in our countries is still very low, and it's our responsibility to look after patients who are non-COVID, who have really end-stage liver disease. Thank you very much.
So thank you, sir. We now move on to the question and answer session, which will be followed by opinion from our expert panel. So first I take the questions for Professor Salimur Rahman, sir. There are a few questions for you, sir. One is, can we use low molecular weight heparin in patients with raised ALT? Since COVID patients have raised ALT, though AST rises more than ALT, can we use low molecular weight heparin in these patients?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Low molecular weight heparin has been used in my country also, and we have got very little experience about using low molecular weight heparin in a liver function abnormality patient. Probably, actually, we can use, to my opinion, we can use low molecular weight. Hello. Hello. Low molecular weight heparin, is it not?
Yes, sir. Whether we can use low molecular weight heparin in patients who have raised ALT with COVID.
Actually, we have already used low molecular weight heparin in some of the cases. I should not mention the name, but we have used it in some of the very VIP patients. And I think Mamun and somebody knows that he has recovered very nicely. So I think there is no obstruction or contraindication in using low molecular weight heparin in cases of liver disease, and especially also in patients with raised SGPT. Somebody, if have experience, they can also tell about this.
Well, I can't resist the experience of sharing my experience. When I had COVID, there was one of my lungs, the right lung had around 20% involvement, and I did take a low molecular weight heparin, and I had raised ALT-AST, but I don't know whether I did the right thing or not. But I also recovered quite uneventfully.
I think, Mamun, you know, low molecular weight heparin was prescribed for one of our professional leaders, and he recovered very nicely. Yeah?
Yes.
He was a very complicated patient.
Yes. So, so the next question is about the drug-drug interaction. Professor Abhijit Chaudhary, the variety of drugs we are using, cocktails of favipiravir, ivermectin, and whatnot, doxycycline, azithromycin, even some homeopathic medicine. So what would you say? Just an overall overview.
I'm so biased against drugs usage that I'm possibly not the right person to put this question into. You know, one of my jobs right now is to go to hospitals, check the, you know, the protocol that's being followed. It's like, you know, people, the railway authorities have got a team to look for the without ticket passengers. Some variety of that job I do in the morning, and try to, you know, empty as many beds as I can give to the team for allotment of beds, because we doctors are also very happy often by keeping asymptomatics and mildly symptomatics, because they are not going to trouble us. So, you know, and that's happening. I'm just sharing loudly, and that would happen everywhere. So one of my jobs over the last 7 days is at 9 o'clock, I undeclaredly, I go to a government hospital, which is a COVID hospital, and, you know, check out whether the patient is symptomatic, asymptomatic, what are the drugs being given. I strike out the drugs, and very clearly, very aggressively, and obviously to the displeasure of many physicians also, I say that nothing other than supplemental high flow oxygen and oxygen only, with a very stringent monitoring on pulse oximeter and your monitors, is to be done. So, you know, and bogus drugs are being used. It's a freestyle wrestling, I should say. And I would incite all of you to come up with this thought that, as Professor Rela has very clearly mentioned, that obviously there is a role for dexamethasone, very clear role which has come out, and heparin, low molecular heparin also. But if you keep these two apart, the antivirals, I think, you know, it's experimental. In India, it's experimental, but it's not remaining experimental. It's being the tocilizumab wonder is being sold in, you know, premium. It's like in black market everywhere in Calcutta. People are not getting it, trying to catch hold of it as a magic remedy. So I think it's one of our responsibility, and that's why I keep on talking about this. We should not drain off people's exchequer in a circumstances when we cannot save the patient, and only oxygen and only liberal use of oxygen, early usage of oxygen can save our patients. So, you know, it's our task to tell that please don't use drugs, because by prescribing, there is a feeling that those doctors who prescribe high price drugs are the bigger doctors. So let's refrain from using all those drugs for which very little evidence exists and it does not work, except dexamethasone and low molecular heparin. So there is no value.
To take this discussion a bit further, a bit of brainstorming, first to you and then to Professor Mohammad Rela. If I say that SARS-CoV-2 is like hepatitis B. It is not a cytopathic virus, and we are not very sure whether any antiviral that we are using has any role. So how will you evaluate this statement? Do we know, sir, whether SARS-CoV-2 is a cytopathic virus or not? Does it itself cause the injury? And if that is the case, then what are we doing with antivirals here? So first to you and then to Professor Mohammad Rela. Sir, could you hear me? Professor Rela, could you hear me?
We were asking somebody else a question.
Yeah, I'll go from you to then Professor Mohammad Ali. Professor.
No, I see. This virus very clearly causes damage to the cells, to the alveolar cells. There is no doubt about that. So it is a cytopathic virus. But there are no antivirals today, as Dr. Abhijit Chowdhury repeatedly says. I believe in that. There is no antiviral to stop the progression of the damage it does. The remdesivir is the only drug where they say it reduces the course of the illness by 2 to 3 days. It actually doesn't do any more than reducing the course of the illness. If you actually give the virus in the later phase, if you give the drug in the later phase, which is actually not the viral phase, in the inflammatory phase, it does nothing. So in the early stages when the drug was not available, people were getting desperate only in the later stages and trying to get it from here and there. And the same is true for tocilizumab. Absolutely does nothing. It probably increases the risk of sepsis in these patients once they are ventilated, and they probably die as a result of giving the IL-6 antibodies. So I agree with that. There are no drugs. But what we are trying to do in this disease is damage control. The damage control is the inflammatory phase. Both prevention of thrombosis, the microthrombi, and reducing the inflammation to increase. So it's oxygen, oxygen, oxygen. But actually to improve the oxygen exchange is what we are doing, using these two drugs for. Sometimes just simply giving oxygen may not actually stop the progression of the disease, because you need to facilitate the oxygen exchange. That is why I'm saying it's the corticosteroids and the anticoagulation which makes any difference. So a small fraction of our patients have been given antiviral so far. You ask me, and again, there is a practical difficulty with even giving the plasma in these patients, because the difficulty is you only think about plasma when the patients are getting sicker, when they go to ICU. You're not thinking about plasma in the early phase of the disease. Then at that phase, there is no point giving the plasma when the viral effect is gone. So we have actually not given plasma for many of these patients. When you talked about interaction, I just want to say only one interaction that we discussed about. When we started in the small proportion of patients where we have given the remdesivir, there is very clearly an interaction that is said. The interaction between dexamethasone and remdesivir is actually in the literature. So we thought we'll go to methylprednisolone if anybody says they want to be given remdesivir. But later on we found actually it makes no difference at all actually to switch to methylprednisolone. And there is some discussion about whether methylprednisolone is better or dexamethasone is better. But dexamethasone is slow acting, and we use it actually at a much lower dose, and it's working. And if it is working at a lower dose, I think it's much better to stick to dexamethasone, and we actually continue dexamethasone even when patients demanding that they have to be given remdesivir.
So, sir, two questions which are relevant to your discussion, if you just would continue. One is someone wanted to know, Dr. Sheikh Mohammed Bahar Hussain, that is there any role of convalescent plasma in the early stage of disease? And there's another question from Dr. Razvi, who wants to know the role of low-dose steroid in moderate case of COVID. So early stage steroid and convalescent plasma, would you recommend that?
You want me to answer that?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I see that for everybody, we need to have a cutoff. When you say early stage disease and you want to give them steroids, who are those patients? 85% of the patients don't require oxygen. So there is no point giving steroids to everyone. So we have to have a point at which we want to give steroids. And that's why it was decided that the moderate patients who are going to require oxygen would be the patients who should be given steroids. So I seriously believe that it should only be given to patients who are going to require oxygen, where their saturation drops to below 94% of the patients who should be. Otherwise, you'll be giving steroids to everyone who tests positive, and that is not possible. So you're now confining it to probably overall about 10% of the COVID positive patients who might require steroids. Convalescent plasma is not an easy thing to do. So you cannot give, again, it's the same thing. You have to fix a point at which you want to give convalescent plasma. Now, majority of the patients are improving steroids alone once they require oxygen. Therefore, if convalescent plasma is to work, it should actually be given early. But there is no need to give it early. So we therefore land up giving convalescent plasma to patients who are actually later. At the later stage, it's not going to work. So there is a huge confusion about using convalescent plasma. We don't want to give it early where it might work, because if you want to give it early where it might work, which are the patients you're going to give? You'll end up giving to a huge number of patients and it's not available. There is no point giving it late. And I therefore am completely confused about when to give convalescent plasma, and therefore we don't land up giving to any of them.
So the last two questions will be to Professor Abhijit Chaudhary. These are on fatty liver. One is whether there is any contraindication of remdesivir and favipiravir in NAFLD patients. And the second question is, how will you recommend lifestyle modification in patients with fatty liver disease these days, especially physical exercise, when we are asking them to stay at home?
Yes, so let me start off again with the second question first, because I would love to answer that, not the first one. So, I'm pretty sure all of us would understand that all of us have put on more fat during the lockdown phase and all these phase when our activity had gone down. I mean, because of imposed thing, and we tend to forget, and that's real, that most of us have got a lot of demotivation over the last 3-4 months of COVID, cloud variety of things. So what I would suggest is, now that it's we are much more open, I think the lifestyle modifications, particularly exercise, is going to be very important, and very important right now at the exercise at home or whatever opportunity we get, and that's going to be the mainstay. Because in NAFLD management right now, I mean, as you know, in Bangladesh, long back obeticholic acid had been there. In India, obeticholic acid had just an entry. And as you know, saroglitazar is also almost getting available in India. So given the fact that some drugs are making their presence felt, but lifestyle modification still remains the mainstay, and we should focus on that. I would tell that, the usage of remdesivir and favipiravir in a patient, obviously it would be dictated by the circumstances of the need for treating COVID. Again, I end up the answer to this question with the rider, that if it is absolutely essential and the judgment is that good that you need to use remdesivir or favipiravir, use that. In people with NAFLD, obviously there will be some enzyme derangements and all, but there are no evidences that these drugs facilitate further downhill courses in people with NAFLD. At least I couldn't come across any such drugs. But I end up by telling that it should be dictated by COVID treatment priorities rather than NASH treatment priorities.
Sir, and there's one more question to you. Do you recommend using obeticholic acid in NASH patients? In NASH.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So obeticholic acid, as you know, have got a very, very clear-cut window of opportunity in those people who have got advanced. It does, in people who have got only fat, it does not help. That's clear. So we should not. And most of our people have got fat only. People who have got more than F2 and F3, it does some help. We also know that. So I am using like many other people, but I'm not sure because the evidence is conflicting. And as you know, FDA had recently put a broader, and had asked Intercept to go more detail into the data to show that it really works. So as of now, it's a lot of us are using, dictated more by market enthusiasm rather than by scientific benefits. Science is not really very tight on this, and I think the confusion would get cleared very soon.
So whatever science is said, this is for patients with F2, F3 fibrosis with fatty liver.
Yes, yes.
So there is one question. So this again goes to Professor Mohammad Rela. One more question for you is that what would you think is the ideal time to start anticoagulant from Dr. ABM Adnan in Cox's Bazar? When do you think we should start this, enoxaparin or rivaroxaban?
We start really Clexane on all patients who are admitted to hospital. If they are symptomatic, if they are admitted to hospital, the regulations is the government has prescribed that if patients are symptomatic, they need to stay for 7 days or 3 days of no fever. That's when they have to be staying. So when patients are stuck in hospital, the maximum that they do is get up and go to the toilet. COVID-19 is a procoagulant condition, and therefore anybody who is admitted to hospital, we give them COVID. We give them 40 milligrams, a single dose of Clexane. If their D-dimer levels, this is a recommendation again, which has come from a study, if their D-dimer levels are more than 4 times normal, then they should go on 40 milligrams BD, really almost a therapeutic dose of Clexane while they're in hospital. That's the policy we follow for patients. For patients who are have comorbidity or additional features or obese, then we give them 60 milligrams one dose. So it's somewhat, I think there is no point in saying 40 milligrams once a day for all patients. There may be patients who are more than 100 kilograms, they'll get a 60 milligrams once a day. So we give it for all patients who are admitted to hospital.
So this is one question to the last question of the session, and this is directed to Professor Salimur Rahman sir. Dr. Debashish Shaha from Bangladesh, he wants to know that there has been a trial called Dhaka trial where favipiravir has showed 96% success rate in comparison with placebo. So should we consider this as some sort of evidence that favipiravir is working? I am not putting these questions to our overseas speakers because it's an unpublished trial, I believe. It has not appeared in the journal. So this was recently disclosed in Dhaka in a meeting, sir. It was, if I'm not wrong, a randomized placebo-controlled, two-arm blinded placebo-controlled trial where they used favipiravir. So they say that it was 96% compared to placebo. So is this some evidence that you would like to accept?
I think, Dr. Mamoon, you have noticed that other two speakers and me also have advocated not on drugs, even remdesivir, which is approved by the FDA, that has not been very much supported by the speakers. They always started saying oxygen, 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 and they have also supported steroid and also low molecular weight heparin. And I think the trial which has been published, they've given, there should be much more trial, and that should be recommended by the standard body all over the world, such as FDA and other agencies. Before that, we cannot say that this is the recommended drug.
Actually, if I'm not wrong, a much larger trial is now going on by Fujifilm subsidiary, Tayoma Corporation. So unless that thing comes, we cannot make any conclusive comment about favipiravir. So,
Yes.
so with this, we come to the end of the question answer session. Now we move on to the panel of experts. First, I would request Professor Dr. Ghulam Masood, head of the Department of Hepatology, Rajshahi Medical College, for his brief comments.
Assalamualaikum. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. first, I remember with respect those our COVID volunteer died of COVID-19, and also wish the early recovery those who are suffering, still suffering from mental and physical suffering from COVID-19 infection. And secondly, thanks to all the speakers, as my direct teacher, Professor Salimur Rahman sir, and Professor Abhijit Chaudhary and Professor Dr. Rela for their nicely elaborated the management of liver disease during COVID-19. COVID-19 is a pandemic situation and all are worried about this, but the good news and hopeful that it has little influence on the healthy liver. Those are not has comorbidities, they have not this chance of suffering from liver disease. As we have already discussed, that only 50% or 54% patients have suffering from hepatitis, and most of them are anecdotal hepatitis. And so spontaneously recovery is the usual rule. There is no specific treatment are required, and only those who have comorbidities, they are the suffering from the severe liver disease. And most of our national and international bodies has accepted different protocol to face this situation. In our context, those who live in the periphery, we only the follow-up the patient by telemedicine or face-to-face visit, though not telemedicine is possible. But regarding the surgical and intervention like RFA or tests, we have not facilities, and we refer this to the higher center Dhaka. So we expect our expert center should be upgraded to face this extra load or these facilities. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ghulam Masood. Now I move on to Dr. Farooq Ahmed, Associate Professor and Head Department of Hepatology at Dhaka Medical College, for his brief opinion.
Thank you, Shopnil. First, I would like to thank our mentor, Professor Salimur Rahman sir, for taking initiative for this today's webinar on behalf of Association for the Study of the Liver Disease Bangladesh. And Professor Mamun also arranged so nicely for this program. Our three eminent speakers, Professor Salimur Rahman sir, Professor Abhijit Chaudhary sir, and Professor Mohammad Rela sir, they have nicely covered all the aspects of the management of COVID-19 pandemic, the chronic liver diseases. Abhijit Chaudhary sir and Professor Rela sir, in fact, they have covered not only NFLD or liver transplant, they have also narrated very nicely about the other management parts also. Especially, I would like Professor Abhijit Chaudhary sir for his emphasized that we have to reduce the fear of the patients and also of our healthcare workers. In this era, you see that as Professor Rela sir already mentioned, that the mortality rate is much lower in our countries, in the subcontinents, like 1.3 to 2% in comparison to especially UK or other European countries. So we have to lessen our fear, and we have to do the patient management, not only the COVID patients, also the non-COVID patients management. So they must not be neglected. We have already started telemedicine for several months.
Dr. Farooq, I'll take just 1 minute from you. Professor Abhijit Chaudhary has to attend another meeting, so we'll continue with your comments. But thank you, Professor Chaudhary, for taking time to.
I'm sorry.
No.
I'm sorry that I have to leave, and Professor Rela, I have got another meeting. So
okay.
I apologize, I have to leave.
No. It was a pleasure. It was a pleasure talking to you, actually. I like the way you presented it. You're passionate about, I understand fully where you're coming from, and you know, as a senior leader in the field in the country, you know, the way you said, I need to clear the beds for the people. I think it's a fantastic. Yeah. Many people, as you say, want to hold on to patients who are well rather than want to treat patients who are sick. Everybody's looking at statistics. I think many of the things that you said about COVID management, I could relate to you, actually. I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity.
On my side, I thanks Professor Abhijit Chaudhary for coming over here and sparing lots of time in this busy schedule. Thank you, Professor Abhijit Chaudhary.
No, thank you, Dada. Thank you, Dada, for the opportunity.
Again, we accept our invitation.
Thank you, Dada.
Thank you.
Even committed. Thank you. Thank you.
धन्यवाद.
Thank you.
So I go back to Professor Farooq, Dr. Farooq Ahmed. Sorry for interrupting you. If you please continue.
Thanks. So what I'm telling before earlier that we have started along with telemedicine services, we have started procedures like emergency endoscopies and other procedures like ERCP. And I would like to emphasize that in all guidelines, everywhere we see that we have to do the emergency endoscopies like when the bleeding peptic ulcers or variceal bleeding. But along with this, I would like to add that the patients with suspected GI malignancy, we should not neglect endoscopy in these patients, like endoscopy or other procedures like colonoscopies. So from this time, we should follow our three eminent speakers, what they have directed us to do. I think with our young hepatologists and other doctors will be much benefited from Professor Selimur Rahman sir, Professor Abhijit Choudhury, and Professor Mohammad Rela from their speech. So I would like to thanks again to all the participants and all the expert panels, along with our three eminent speakers. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Farooq Ahmed. It's my pleasure now to invite Dr. Fazal Karim, Associate Professor and Head, Department of Hepatology, Sir Salimullah Medical College, for his brief comments.
Thank you, Professor Shokil, for asking me to say something. I am thankful to my professor, Professor Selimur Rahman sir, Professor Abhijit sir, and also Professor Rela for very informative presentation. I like to have some comments from Professor Rela regarding if a transplant patient develops COVID, do we need to reduce the dose of steroids and other things?
Not really. So I've not had a post-transplant patient so far getting a COVID. We have been very fortunate. I have heard that there are other centers who have had a COVID in the post-transplant period. I think the dose of steroids that we use in the transplant patients, other than the methylprednisolone that is used on the day during the surgery, the dose is actually quite small. The maximum dose we use is 20 milligrams of methylprednisolone. But the treatment of COVID itself, the steroid dose is given for COVID is actually much higher than transplant patients. So I would say you cannot stop steroids in transplant patients. In fact, they could actually benefit from slightly increasing the dose of steroids in transplant patients if they were to develop COVID complications. The problem is in transplant patients going to be in the immediate post-operative period, whether they are more prone for getting septic complications. So we may be reducing other immunosuppressive drugs, but certainly not steroids.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, would you like to add anything else, Dr. Fazal Karim?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So now I move on to Dr. Mahbub Hussain, Associate Professor and Head Department of Hepatology at Rangpur Medical College, for his comments, please.
Thank you, Mamun Al Mahatub Shapnil sir. Assalamu alaikum. I'm very happy to be a part of this valuable and very informative discussions. First, I want to give thanks Professor Selimur Rahman sir, who is my mentor and also my father-like teacher. He told many things about CLD and COVID-19 infection. May I ask one question, sir? Why the picture, the hepatic enzyme during COVID is like alcoholic liver disease, not like viral hepatitis disease? Can you hear me, sir? Hello? Hello?
Dr. Selimur Rahman sir, please unmute yourself. You're not audible.
Hello?
Yes.
Sir, can you hear me, sir?
Hear me?
Selimur Rahman, sir?
Can you
Sir?
hear me?
Yes, sir. Now I can hear you. Sir, can you tell why the picture is like alcoholic-like, not like viral?
Mention it's not very definite, but I have mentioned few points. 3 points. One of them is it also involves the heart, and there is cardiomyopathy for which AST may be raised. And another is ischemic hepatitis is one of the important feature in this. And these two may be one of the factor that AST is more than ALT. Otherwise, more than that, I have no knowledge about that. More than that, if anybody can say more than that, is allowed.
Can I say something? I found that question very interesting, actually. Why is it not like a viral hepatitis? I mean, the viral hepatitis enzymes are extremely high because these viruses are actually heterotrophic viruses. COVID affects the liver, but COVID affects the liver it has to actually bind to the ACE2 inhibitor, the ACE2
Receptors.
the receptors. The ACE2 receptors are highly concentrated only in the biliary epithelium, actually. And therefore, it's unlikely for you to get a cell death like you do in other viral hepatitis. So you can't you can't actually see the same level of enzymes that you see in other viral hepatitis in COVID-19. You shouldn't expect it anyway.
Okay, thank you, sir. Again, can you hear Swapnil sir? Swapnil sir, can you hear me? Hello?
I can hear you, yeah.
Okay. So next I give thanks to Professor Abhijit Chaudhary sir, though he is not now on the on computer. He nicely said about the NAFLD or MAFLD with COVID-19 infection. I can share my experience. I am in, I live in a remote part of Bangladesh and northern part. It is called Rangpur division. When I remain in my house and observe television, everywhere there is COVID. In America, it is rising. In Europe, again, it is rising. In China, again, it is attacking. And I am really afraid of what is happening here. And when I go to my office, I see on the road, the people are without mask. They are laughing, they are talking, they are enjoying like without COVID infection. I am really confused. What is happening? When in my room, I am afraid. But when I am outside, I get some fresh air. I get some pleasure. So Abhijit, I think Abhijit told finally, we have to give some advice socially. Social involvement should be more to fight against COVID infection. And again, I lastly thanks Professor Mohammad Rela sir. He's a great man. He's a very world known liver transplant surgeon. And thanks, sir. You give much time and energy for this seminar, liver transplantation during COVID pandemic. You nicely evaluate everything. So you go ahead with risk and benefits, sir. Take care of your health. And thank you very much with this few words. Thank you, sir. Swapnil sir, thank you.
Thank you for that advice. Thank you. Yeah, I do worry about it, but we have to live through it.
Yes.
So the last expert panel opinion will come from Professor Dr. Alok Kumar Raha. Dr. Alok Kumar Raha is the head of the Department of Hepatology at Chittagong Medical College. So I think Alok got disconnected. I'm not sure.
No, he's here.
No, Alok is here.
He's here.
Yeah, Alok. Yeah, your comments, please.
Can you hear me? Hello.
Yeah, we can.
It is a great honor and privilege for me to be a panel of experts in this August gathering. I must thank all three speakers for their very nice presentation. We have much benefited from this discussion. Actually, we are not aware or we are not well prepared for this pandemic in earlier. We have to deal liver disease, especially in advanced stage in our country. As this pandemic is going on, it is very difficult to manage this group of patients, especially in asymptomatic group. We have to perform or sometimes require endoscopic intervention in this group of patients. But it is now said that RT-PCR should be negative within 72 hours of this for performing this group of patient endoscopic procedure. But it is sometimes not feasible for us in this resource constrained country like us. So my question to all speakers, can we start antibody testing for this group of patients, which may be, I think, which may be helpful for this group of patients. So thank you. Thanks for all for your kind hearing. Okay.
So, was your question directed to any of the particular speakers? We have Dr. Mohammad Rela and Professor Salimur Rahman on the screen. Who would you like to answer?
I can answer.
Yeah, please, sir.
Your problem is doing RT-PCR before endoscopy. There is almost a 30% false negativity with RT-PCR. We have seen that patients who have had RT-PCR negative post-operatively can become positive. We've seen that. So I think you just have to assume that every patient who is negative, you need to take care when you're doing endoscopy procedure because it's a high-risk procedure. You will have to wear PPEs in the room when you're doing endoscopy procedures. There is no other way other than being careful about it. Even if you are testing negative, you have to assume that there may be an element of positivity in that. With respect to your question on the antibody testing, I don't think antibody testing is going to be useful because currently the only antibody test that they have is doesn't differentiate, is IgG antibody. And your IgG antibody is not going to be positive for at least 2 weeks from the onset of illness. So 2 weeks from the onset of illness is too late actually, because these patients would have been, I mean, if somebody's antibody test positive, it doesn't mean that they have the active viral infection. They may have had the virus, say, a month ago or 2 months ago, and you're not going to exclude them. In fact, those patients may be safer patients to do rather than the patients who are antibody negative. So I don't believe that currently antibody testing will help you in any way in knowing whether a patient is COVID positive or not. So if they are positive, then you can exclude them, which is 70% of the patients. In 30% of the patients, there is a false negativity, and therefore, every patient you put on the table to do an endoscopy, you have to have in mind there is a potential possibility that that patient may be positive. You have to take precautions. There is no other go. So it's a different way of looking at things in this world.
So thank you, Professor Mohammad Rela. With this, we come to the...
We can, Mamun.
Yeah, please, sir.
Except that we should treat all the patients as positive when we are doing any invasive procedure. Huh?
That's right.
As if the patient is positive, then that is safe for us. Huh?
That's correct. Unless like Professor Mamun, you have recovered from COVID, then you can simply wear a mask. Yeah.
So thank you very much. With this, we come to the end of this session. I'd like to thank Professor Mohammad Rela, Professor Abhijit Chaudhary, Professor Salimur Rahman sir for giving us your valuable time. Thank you to the panel of expert members and of course the audience. The scientific partner of today's program was Beacon Pharmaceuticals. I am also grateful to them. For the information of the audience, on World Hepatitis Day, 28th July at 11 a.m. in the morning, the association is going to arrange another webinar and you will receive the information. Please make it convenient to attend. With this, I conclude this session. Thank you very much.
One language I want to say.
Please, sir.
I want to say one language.
Please,
I want to thank everybody. I want to thank everybody, especially Professor Abhijit Chaudhary and Professor Mohammad Rela and all the panels of experts and the all the registered person who have listened to our talk and cooperated, and especially also the Beacon Pharmaceuticals for arranging so nice seminar, and also Dr. Mamun, our Secretary General of the association, for organizing and conducting the session so nicely. Thank you all for your participation.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you.